I woke up at 3:30 a.m. this morning. I jumped into my ice bath, got out, went for a 10-mile run, listened to 2 audiobooks, came home, made myself a protein smoothie with a lot of protein, creatine, and athletic greens mixed in. And then I meditated for 30 minutes. I wrote in my gratitude journal for 30 minutes. And now it's 7 a.m. and I'm ready to start the day. Absolutely nothing that I just said in the last few sentences is in any way true. I mean, I did technically wake up at 3:30 a.m., but that was to use the toilet, and then I got back into bed and I slept again. But I am super productive, and I am really good at managing time. And over the course of the next few minutes, I want to share with you the most useful evidence-based strategies that you can apply so that you can become more masterful over the way in which you use time. I want to share with you the keys to productivity, the principles, as well as the strategies of how you can be super productive and get a lot more done and be a lot more happy with what you get done. Get ready for a masterclass, as always, packed with information. Welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we are going to be diving into the world of productivity. We're going to be looking at what are the things that you can do to be more effective at managing your time, managing your life, and become more productive with the moments that you have. We all get to spend time doing something, and just like spending money, you want to make sure that wherever your time is going, you're investing your time in things that provide you with a wonderful sense of happiness, allow you to be able to have an even more magnificent future. So as we get into time management, I want to give you an example as to why I do have some credibility in this area. Many years ago, I actually presented a TV show called Not Enough Hours. It was on prime time in television on Wednesday evenings, I believe. And in it, I would go around the country working with people, helping them with their time management issues. They all had the same issue, which was Not Enough Hours, which is the name of the show. Very clever. And I was to help them with whatever it was, prioritization, organizing their time, being able to say no. Here is a clip just to show you how I looked back then.
Are you saying that gives you room and more room inside your head to think positively?
Exactly. And it's not necessarily just about thinking positively, it's about thinking pragmatically, usefully, practically.
So you're saying if I write down any worries I have?
If you write down, that's going to take a fair whack out of it completely, out of the way you feel about it. That's the first step. The second step is to look at it and then to figure out what is the solution to this. And the solution isn't to sit there and feel bad about it.
Now, I know what you're thinking. You're looking at that and you're going, Owen, was that recorded yesterday? You haven't changed a bit. You look the exact same as you did back then. Slightly less hair, and I appreciate it, and thank you for the compliment. But actually, that was done back in 2008. So that's quite a long time ago. But in it, a lot of the strategies that I used, and a lot of the strategies that I used on TV with the various different people I worked with, they're the same strategies that have enabled people to be able to master their use of time. And what I want to do in this episode is walk you through what those strategies are. Now, before we get to the actual techniques and the actual practical things you can do, before we get into that, I want to talk about some of the principles of time management, the principles of productivity, some of the most interesting insights that we've gained from some of the great purveyors of wisdom out there in this space. Before we get into that, we'll touch on the history. Let's start by looking at, first and foremost, what do we mean by time management? Now, some people will have an issue with it and they'll go, oh, don't say time management. You're not managing time. You can't manage time. Time's not possible to be managed. And I understand, and you're right. It's not managing time. If you want me to say managing life, ask me. I can't hear you, so I'm just going to call it managing time. But if you hear it managing time, managing life, same thing. Being productive, same kind of thing. Being productive is obviously producing in as efficient way as possible. And that begs the question, what do we mean by efficient? And efficient means doing something with the least amount of effort required and the least amount of waste involved. And then effective means doing the right thing. So you want to be efficient and effective to the best of your ability. And if you can be efficient and effective, you'll definitely be productive. And that in turn will mean that you're managing your time particularly well. Let's start by looking at the history of time management and productivity. And of course, you will have examples of philosophers like Confucius talking about the importance of discipline and moral conduct and how you decide to spend your time. Aristotle, in his book Nicomachean Ethics, looked at the importance of what he called flourishing and ensuring there's a form of balance and self-discipline in the pursuit of doing the right thing, what he called virtuous activities. But it's about using your time correctly, using your time to do good. And Marcus Aurelius, in his wonderful book, Meditations, and in fact, also Seneca in On the Shortness of Life, they're both two examples of the Stoic philosophy. Both of them talked about the importance of living every moment on purpose. And Seneca has a great quote where he talks about wealth being measured in terms of free time rather than material possessions, something we mentioned on another episode. Meditations really is one of the best books out there. A wonderful book by Marcus Aurelius. It's really his diary as a Roman emperor. And in it, one of the things he talks about is self-discipline and the value of time. And if you look at the way a lot of these ancient experts talked about time management or productivity, they really did emphasize discipline, and they emphasize the importance of recognizing the time we have. There's a great notion in Stoicism called memento mori, and we'll talk about it a little later, but in a nutshell, it means you're going to die. I love it. I love it because it's so powerful, right? Telling yourself, reminding yourself you're going to die, it just hopefully will make you more urgent about the way in which you spend every single moment. You're going to die, therefore you need to make this moment count. Now, there's another way to look at it. You could go, you're going to die, so what's the point? Just going to waste it. There's no point. There's no point in doing anything. So, well, why? Because I'm going to die. Memento mori. So you could get it twisted that way. I'm sure Marcus or any one of the Stoics, Seneca or any of the lads, I'm sure they would look back and they would say, no, memento mori, you're going to die. It's a good thing because it reminds you, well, you need to get to it. You need to put in some effort. Okay? Urgency. So there's some of the historical examples. I do want to touch on the neuroscience. We have to look at the brain science of what goes on in the brain when we are actually mastering some of the skills we need to be able to master time. And so the first thing to realize is the role of neurotransmitters like dopamine are involved. Dopamine, of course, is the motivation molecule. It's responsible for driving us towards the things that we want. And when we're motivated, we're more likely to be performing better. We're more likely to be taking action. We're less likely to be procrastinating. So dopamine is an important chemical, and we need to be able to find strategies that allow us to trigger the release of dopamine. That means setting goals that excite us. That means breaking down tasks into manageable chunks. That means measuring the progress we're making towards a goal. Those are all ways to increase the amount of dopamine that is flooding through our brain. We also need to recognize things like serotonin makes us feel more emotionally stable and more focused and less likely to have our attention skewed in another direction. Acetylcholine is also a chemical that has been associated with our focus. And norepinephrine or epinephrine or adrenaline as it's also known, is also about the energy and attention that we might give to particular tasks. So we need to recognize that these kind of neurotransmitters do have an impact upon how effectively we're able to manage time. But sometimes when we're very stressed, we have the chemical cortisol, which by its nature is actually quite important and useful for us. It gets us to pay attention to things. But if it's constantly in our system, this form of chronic stress can actually negatively impact the ability we have to make good decisions and to be disciplined. And remember, just like Marcus and Confucius and all the boys and the lads that we mentioned earlier, talk about the importance of self-discipline. Self-discipline is negatively impacted by the amount of stress that we experience. And that's because oftentimes cortisol affects the front part of our brain known as the prefrontal cortex. And this is where the real executive function lies. This is the sort of the seat of our discipline. There's another part of our brain called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, which is really the seat of where our will is. And when you look at the prefrontal cortex and you look at trying to activate that more, it really comes down to you being able to master the art of discipline, becoming more disciplined. When it comes to the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, the AMCC, the more you do things that you don't feel like doing, even though they're good for you, the more you take that action, the more you're actually enlarging that part of your brain, which has lots of positive benefits for you in your life. So being more disciplined isn't just something that's a nice thing to do and isn't even just something that helps you to be more productive. Being more disciplined actually improves the way your brain functions and actually affects some areas of the brain quite powerfully. And so we need to recognize that there is something that we need to change in the brain, and doing things you don't want to do but you know are good for you, that by its very nature is going to have lots of brain impact. The next thing to realize is that brain plasticity, or what we call neuroplasticity, means that we can build new connections. And the more we can build those new connections, the easier things will be. So the more you practice being focused, the more you practice being organized, the more easy it'll be for you to be more organized and to be able to practice. But you also need to give yourself a break, because our brain goes through a sort of a rhythm, 90-minute phases where we are fully focused and then we get distracted on a natural basis. Our attention goes in peaks and troughs. And so it's really important for us to respect this, what is sometimes called an ultradian rhythm, and to be able to make it so we give ourselves regular breaks every hour, every 90 minutes or so. So lots of techniques we'll talk about a little later on that. And the final thing to mention is what we call the default mode network. This is the network in the brain responsible for mind wandering. And oftentimes what will happen is whenever we do get distracted, this DMN is activated. What we want to be able to do is learn the art of toggling it on and off. So for example, being able to give ourselves the break where we can allow our DMN to start to go crazy, and then move it back to what we call the positive task network, where we're using more of that executive function and we're focusing fully on a task. When you get really skilled at the ability to switch on and off, become focused, and then allow yourself to be distracted, you will be a lot more productive, because you'll be able to do the things you need to do when you need to do them. But a large part of that actually comes down to breaks. Taking breaks and giving yourself the rest so that your mind can wander, so that you can bring it back on schedule. And so a lot of the things we'll talk about a little later are going to be showing you exactly what you need to do to be more productive. But I wanted to provide you with a little bit of context with regards to the neuroscience, so that you can understand, oh, this is not just some crap coming out of Owen's head. There's an actual brain science reason for it. Plus, most importantly, you can look super smart in front of your friends, right? It can be almost as if you were listening to Andrew Huberman. And Andrew Huberman is I love his podcast, that Huberman Lab podcast. It's excellent. I would definitely recommend it. Obviously, don't watch it now, like keep watching this episode. But, if you're looking for another episode to watch on top of this one, Huberman Lab is an excellent one. And it's really good for showing off as well, because you can go in and go, did you know, like this part of your brain is this and this part. Just makes you sound a lot smarter than you might actually be. And I'm not saying that from experience. But I want to get into the principles of productivity. And I want to talk you through 10 principles of productivity. And some of these you will have heard of, but I'm guessing a number of them you won't have heard of before. So I'm going to share with you each principle. I'm going to talk you through each one and give you a little bit about where it came from. And it will help you conceptualize and think about productivity a little differently, I believe. We'll start off with what we call Parkinson's Law. And this was named after Cyril Northcote Parkinson. Now that's a fancy name if I ever heard it. And in 1955, he wrote an article for, I think, The Economist, where he said something along the lines of work expands to fit the time available. So work expands to fit the time allotted. And he was talking about the British civil service at the time, and pretty much saying, if you give them a week to do it, they'll do it. If you give them 2 weeks to do it, they'll do the exact same thing. If you give them a month to do it. So he was talking about the inefficiency of the British civil service at the time. But this became a very popular principle because intuitively we know there's lots of examples of that. If you only get a short amount of time, then it's something that you know that you're going to be a lot more focused for. And it also connects with the idea of, if you want something done, give it to someone who's busy, because they'll be super efficient with it. And so this is an important and fascinating principle to keep in mind in terms of productivity. The second principle is the Pareto principle. I'm sure most of you will have heard of this. This is based upon Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian economist in the 19th century. He, once upon a time, I promise I'll stop. I know a lot of my friends that are Italian are watching this and you're like, oh, and you kill me. I mean, I want to like you. I want to think you're a nice person. And then you do the Italian accent. And when you do the Italian accent, my soul dies a little bit every single syllable. So please stop. And I hear you. And I will stop. I promise. Prometo. I don't even know if that's, how do you say I promise, but I'll try. Vilfredo Pareto, anyway, he said basically that 80% of the land is owned by 20% of the population. And this 80-20 rule, as it was known, started to become popularized in lots of other things. So in productivity, it says that roughly 80% of the results you get come from 20% of the actions you take. And that's an important principle because it means if you're trying to prioritize, for example, what you want to do is you want to focus on what are the 20% actions that we're taking that's going to yield 80% of the results. And by looking at it like that, it helps make you more productive. The third principle is Murphy's Law. Now, Murphy's Law, this is interesting. I only found out about the history of this a couple of months ago. Murphy's Law is not something that just is like I always thought it was just an Irish way of thinking about life. Whatever can go wrong will go wrong, and probably in the worst way. Like that's something that like we would say to each other back home, right? We've got a dark sense of humor. So it's like a normal conversation with a friend. But actually, Murphy's Law doesn't come from that. It comes from a guy called Edward A. Murphy Jr., who was an engineer working on an Air Force project in 1949. And basically, he was trying to find out how much sudden deceleration a person could withstand in a crash, right? So it's like a safety thing. And after finding a transducer, which was wired wrong, he said, if there's any way to do it wrong, he will find it. And he was referring to the technician that was involved. And the project manager heard him say this and kept using it over and over again. So it was actually this guy, Edward A. Murphy, was insulting or throwing shade, or as we call it back home, slagging this poor old technician. And that insult became a popular quote. If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. And in the very worst way possible and whatnot. I also, by the way, have a law that I extended called Murphy's Cousin's Law. So technically, I suppose this would be Edward's cousin. I don't know if you had a cousin, you're probably not still alive because you were working in 1949. Maybe you are. If you are and you're watching, imagine Edward A. Murphy was watching this podcast. Wouldn't that be amazing? Reach out. Write into the comments. It would be great to hear from you. Anyway, Edward's cousin, I have Murphy's Cousin's Law, which is if something can't go wrong, it'll still probably go wrong. So that's even more negative. Next law we have is Hofstadter's Law. And this was by Erich Hofstadter, where he said it always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's Law. Love that. One of those recursive, like Inception type things. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's Law. And this is the tendency that we have to underestimate the amount of time that we need to complete tasks. Like we always underestimate it. And it's really important for us to recognize there will be more than likely unexpected delays. So we need to be ready for them. The next one is the Peter Principle. And this is in 1969. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to their level of incompetence. I mean, to me, I'm looking at these principles. I'm starting to think, starting to sound like these principles were all extracted from people just, insulting people and being dicks. Like that's what I'm kind of getting from this is all of these principles are just different insults that people have thrown around that someone has extracted them and gone, oh, that's a great principle for time management. And it's like, you're such an idiot. That's a great principle for time management. What does it mean? It means don't be an idiot. Great, let me write that down. Fitzpatrick, 2024, don't be an idiot. Fitzpatrick's Law. Do you get what I'm saying? A bit crazy. Anyway, he basically, from his experience, noticed that a lot of times there was a lot of inefficiency, let's just say, a lot of work that wasn't really getting done. And so he said, in hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to the level of incompetence. Ergo, there's an awful lot of incompetence in the world. So recognizing one's strengths and the pitfalls of over-promotion, in other words, promoting people when they don't deserve it, that's something you need to be aware of. The next law is the law of diminishing returns. And this is really that there's a point at which the level of benefits that you gain is less than the amount of effort or energy or money. So from a productivity standpoint, this would mean that it highlights the inefficiency of overworking. So if you overwork, you might get a certain amount done, but over time, the amount that you're overworking will actually not provide you with as much of a return on that energy investments as you might think. So just overdoing it is fine in the short term, but over the long term, it's not really worth it, if you get me. The next is Okwen's Law, and this is named after Arthur Melvin Okwen, an American economist in the 60s. And it says that reducing hours worked doesn't necessarily lead to proportionate decreases in output. So once again, this highlights efficiency improvements. So it's just because you work less hours doesn't necessarily mean you get less done. Once again, it's kind of like a much more subtle way of saying that people are lazy. You can pretty much summarize a lot of these with people are lazy if you ask me, but you haven't asked me. The next one is the 90-90 rule. This is a fun one, half joking, suggesting that the first 90% of a project takes 90% of the time, and the last 10% of a project takes the other 90% of the time. See, 90 plus 90 is 180%, doesn't work out. But if you've ever written a book, let me tell you, this feels so true. You're 90% through the book. The last 10% feels like another 90%. So definitely I can relate to that one. Just two more. The planning fallacy. This is by the wonderful Danny Kahneman and his partner at the time, Amos Tversky, in 1979. This planning fallacy is the fact that we tend to underestimate the time needed to complete future tasks, despite knowing that similar tasks have taken longer in the past. So it's almost like we ignore the fact that this took 2 hours before, and we think, oh, I'll get it done in 1 hour. And then it takes 2 hours, and we're like, oh, I can't believe it took 2 hours. That's amazing. No, it's not. It took 2 hours last week. What changed? You idiot. See? I'm getting close to coming up with my own principle, I'm telling you. Even if Fitzpatrick Law doesn't take on, I'm going to keep working on these insults. The last one is Moore's Law. The co-founder of Intel in 1965, he talked about the fact that there was a doubling of the amount of transistors in every microchip every 2 years, even though the price of computers was dropping. And so this really has been something that is being used to describe sort of the ridiculous compound exponential increase of technology. So technology is developing so quickly and so fast, it's almost impossible to keep up. And so we really are bombarded with so much information. Like the amount of information that we're exposed to on a daily basis is ridiculously more than we would have been exposed to even 10 years ago. So it's important to recognize that sort of acceleration of information. So those laws are pretty cool. I mean, number one, they're really good from a managing time perspective. Number two, if you ever want to insult someone in a kind of more subtle way, love it. Peter Principle, you're incompetent. Murphy's Law, if there's any way to get it wrong, you're going to get it wrong. I love how petty these things are. Let's get into some of the books, some basic books that were written on time management. One of the earliest ones in the 20th century, at least, was How to Live on 24 Hours a Day by Arnold Bennett. It was in 1910. Pretty much in a nutshell, if you were to summarize that, he really says, get a life, right? So in a nutshell, he's like, again, another kind of insult, but you need to spend time on things that make you feel good, right? Don't work too much. It's probably a reaction to the industrialization that was a big part of the century beforehand. He also, though, points out the difference between being busy and being productive. Right? Being busy is, I've got lots to do, but being productive is actually getting things done. Peter Drucker in the 60s, in 1967, well-known author, talks about in his book, The Effective Executive, the importance of being effective over efficient. So it's not just being efficient, it's about prioritizing and really emphasizes the importance of prioritizing. This is also highlighted in one of the most important books of all time written in the area of productivity or even self-improvement or professional development, which was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And in it, he has chapters on one of the principles is put first things first, prioritize, begin with the end in mind, which helps you figure out what's most important. But he also is one of the main people that introduced this notion of the Eisenhower matrix. And it's a technique I'll talk to you a little bit later on, named after the former president of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And this was something that he sort of made famous. A lot of people used the Eisenhower matrix as a result of reading it in the 7 Habits book. And it's a very effective strategy we will get to in a bit. Eat That Frog by Brian Tracy is another popular one. In a nutshell, the idea of that is get the hardest job done first. So if you have stuff to eat the frog first. I don't know why it's eating the frog. It's probably because you don't want to eat the frog. But I believe if you're in France, then frogs' legs are quite nice. So maybe they will have to change the name of that book. It'll be Eat the Mussels first, then you can have the frog as a reward. I was so close on putting on a French accent there. I didn't. And I didn't out of respect for the French people here, because I know that the Italians are already probably annoyed at me. I'm not going to have the French people in the same way. Really good book called Deep Work by Cal Newport. Talks about the importance of being able to focus like a laser for 2-3 hours at a time on particular subjects. So dealing with giving yourself that opportunity to have deep work time will allow you to avoid the many traps that come with the distractions and interruptions of the modern age. And if you pair that with another wonderful book called Essentialism, which is by Greg McKeown. So Deep Work is by Cal Newport, as I mentioned. Essentialism by Greg McKeown is less about the technique of actually focusing on something and more about realizing that we have a choice as to what we're going to focus on. And we really need to recognize very little is actually important. So we should seek to pursue less and focus on only what's critically important to us. Make it so we all bring everything down to what's the most essential thing, what's the most important thing. And he says, if it's less than 90% important to you, you should try to drop it. Make time for play, make time for enjoying yourself, make time for sleep, some important elements. So again, kind of goes hand in hand with deep work. Essentialism is about making the choice to do less and focus on one thing, and deep work is, okay, so this is how you would do it. Next, let's get to one of the most important books out there in the field of productivity called Getting Things Done by Dave Allen. And this is known as the art of stress-free productivity. And it really is one of the most popular approaches. It's called GTD approach. And it's one of the most popular approaches to being more productive. Dave Allen suggests, first of all, you need to capture everything outside of your head. The problem and the reason why we're so stressed is we're trying to keep track of everything inside our head. And in a world where so much information is coming at us, our ability to be able to organize everything is really, really struggling. And so what we need to be able to do is capture everything outside on paper, on the computer, so that we can organize things in a more effective manner. He says we need to break tasks down into smaller components and to be able to make it so that we're clear-minded and responsive, so we're only focusing on what's the next thing I need to do. And he's a straightforward system for it. He says that there's a number of different steps, 5 to be clear, of what we need to do in order for us to be able to use this system. The first one is to capture everything that has your attention. So everything that's on your mind, you find a way to capture it. You write it down on a notepad, you put it out onto your computer system, but you get everything that's inside your head outside. Every project, every to-do, you put it all out there. That's the first step. The second one is to clarify it, to figure out, is this something that I can do right now? And he always has this 2-minute rule, which is if you can do it in 2 minutes, do it immediately. Now, if you can't do it in 2 minutes, then put it to be actioned and schedule the action. If it's actionable, you note that it's actionable. You schedule it at a certain point in time. So you either do it if it's less than 2 minutes, or you schedule it for action at a later point in time. You also want to then be prepared to throw stuff away. But clarifying in this context is understanding, is it something that you can do right now? Is this something you need to schedule? Is this something to throw away that you're not going to do? Let's just face it. Let's just come to terms with it. Or is it incubated? Is it something that you'll sit on and put into sort of a someday? After clarifying and capturing, the next step is organize. So put it where it belongs. Figure out exactly where you need to have it. So if it's in the schedule, it's in the schedule. If it's gone, if it's in the someday list, have it there. Reflect and review on this regularly, so make sure you're keeping tabs on exactly what you need to do, what actions you need to take, what projects you're working on. And finally, engage. Take the actions that you need to at this moment in time. You might have things organized in terms of projects, which you organize in terms of themes. Next actions that you might have certain contexts, so where are you going to take those actions or do those projects? There might be a list for what you're waiting for responses from your email. The someday maybe list, someday I'm going to do this. Maybe I'm going to do that. These are the things you're kind of thinking, maybe one day. And then there's reference material, stuff that you might use, be able to refer to, just to remind you whatever it's about. And then finally, your calendar, and organizing your calendar effectively as possible. So Dave Allen's book, it's really good, really effective, and lots of good wisdom in there. It's one of the better books out there for sure. So there's another book I want to talk about, but before I get to it, I really want to dive into the techniques that you can use in order for you to be more productive or for you to manage time better. And we're going to start by prioritization techniques. So the first prioritization technique is simply setting goals. You could set SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and timely. The reason that's a prioritization technique is one of the ways to prioritize is figure out what you want to achieve, and then figure out what actions that are on your schedule are connected to what you want to achieve, right? Very simple form of prioritizing. If you want something a little bit more advanced than that, you can use what we call the Eisenhower matrix. Now, this is what I talked to you about earlier, where Stephen Covey mentions it. And in a nutshell, it's based upon the quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower, former president, where he said roughly along the lines of, there are certain things that are important, and there's certain things that are urgent, and they're not necessarily the same. And that's not necessarily even remotely close to his accent, but it's close enough to what he did say, because he made a distinction between what's important and urgent. And so the matrix works like this. What you do is you go through all the tasks you have to do, and you ask yourself the question, is this really important? Does it need to be done? Has it a big impact? And then you ask yourself for each task, is this urgent? As in, does it need to be done today? Is there a time deadline on this? And if it's urgent and important, it goes into quadrant 1. These are tasks that you do, the crisis management tasks. You take action straight away. If it's important, but it's not urgent, it doesn't have to be done straight away, then it goes into quadrant 2. These are the tasks that you schedule. In quadrant 3, if it is urgent, but it's not important, so if it's not done, it's not the end of the world, it's not a huge impact, but if it's going to be done, it needs to be done soon, then it's in quadrant 3. And these are tasks that you can delegate if you can, or at least drop it to lower in the list. And finally, there are tasks that are both not important and not urgent. These are the things that make us feel busy, but not necessarily productive. If they're not done, it's not the end of the world. If we are going to do them, it doesn't matter when we do them. And these are tasks you want to delete, the very least drop them at the very bottom of the list. And what this matrix allows us to do is not fall into the trap of thinking that everything that's urgent is also important. Sometimes there's things that are really important but not urgent. And sometimes there's things that really aren't that important and shouldn't be prioritized. So you want to prioritize quadrant 1, quadrant 2, then quadrant 3, and hopefully delete what was in quadrant 4. And for a lot of people, this is a really, really cool strategy. If that's not to your fancy, there's also what we call the ABC technique. This is basically going through all your tasks and giving it an A, a B, or a C. And if it's an A, it's like really needs to be done. If it's a B, it's like really like to be done, but it's not as important as the A. And if it's a C, oh, I'd love this to be done, but it's not a B, and it's certainly not an A. And what you do is you label all of your tasks an A, B, or a C. Then you take the A's and you list them out. You take the B's, you list them out. You take the C's, you list them out. And if you want to go even more advanced, then you can A, B, C, the A's. Like what absolutely, positively, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious needs to be done, then what super needs to be done, and then what really needs to be done. And you can A, B, C, the A's, A, B, C, the B's, A, B, C, the C's. And by doing so, as you can see, you get to the place where you start to understand the hierarchy in terms of what your priorities actually are. That's the ABC technique. And the third technique for you, you're thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, Owen, this is great. We're getting not just one, not just two, we're getting 3 techniques. Yes, the third technique is based upon the Pareto principle. With this, what you do is you make a list of all your tasks, then you identify all your goals, what you want to achieve with the tasks, and then you make a connection and you go, which are the tasks that yield most of the results? Which are the tasks that let you achieve most of your goals? And when you identify those tasks, they're the 20% that creates the 80%, so they're the things you need to spend more time on. The next strategy from a prioritization point of view is the eat the frog technique. This is the simplest one. It's basically eat the frog, as in whatever is the biggest, hardest project, do it first. Why? Because when you get it done first, when you wake up in the morning, usually your cortisol levels are up, your adrenaline's up, and so you're more likely to have more energy first things first. So therefore, tackle the hardest project first, get it out of the way, and the rest of your day will go wonderfully as a result. Then we've also got the Moscow method. And let me tell you about the Moscow method. This is a very interesting strategy of time management. The reason it is called the Moscow method is not because it's Russian. Instead, it's because the Mo of Moscow stands for must have. The SCO stands for should have and could have. And the W stands for won't have. So it's you put all of your tasks into the must have done this. I should have done this. I could have done this and I won't have done this. And it's like you're organizing it that way. And if you do it with a Russian accent, it's even more fun. There's one more prioritization technique I want to share with you, which I think is quite cool. It's called the Action Priority Matrix. And it's basically about impact and effort. And so the way this works is that you evaluate the tasks based upon how much impact does this task have? And how much effort does this task require? And if it is high impact and low effort, it's a quick win. If it's high impact and high effort, then it's a major project. If it's low impact and it's a low effort, so it's easy to do and it doesn't make that much of a difference, it's a fill-in. And if it's low impact, makes a little bit of difference, but it's high effort, then it's a thankless task. Not a tankless, as in we're not getting into war, a thankless task. It's one of those ones you go, I put in all that effort and you know how many people thank me? Nobody. Thankless. Not going to prioritize that in the future. So those are some prioritization techniques. So let's now unpack organization. Organization is how you organize your workload. And probably the best approach to this is really taken from the work of Dave Allen, right? In the sense of what I call, or what is called, open and closed lists. An open list is when you put out, like the capture thing that Dave talks about, you put out every single thing you have to do, everything that you have on your mind, you stick it all out on a list. And you organize it around what you have to do over the next few weeks, the next month or so. You have this big plan in front of you. And then a closed list is a list that you do the night before the following day, and it's just about the following day. And the reason it's called a closed list is you can't add anything to it. So it's completely closed in the sense that you can swap stuff. So you can take something out and put something else in, but you can't add anything to it because it's closed. But the notion is that you give yourself the 5 or 6, whatever it is, tasks to do the following day. And by doing so, by having that list, you're much more likely to actually be able to get through it. And so the benefit of an open list is that it provides you with the ability to get everything out of your head so that you can release the stress. The benefit of the closed list is it allows you to make regular progress. And it gives you the opportunity to be able to take things off so you get that burst of dopamine and you can feel like you're making some momentum. So I highly recommend the open and closed list. This is something that I do regularly and I find it extremely useful. There's also the 2-minute rule, which is what I mentioned. Dave Allen suggested as well, which is if something can be done in 2 minutes, do it. There's the importance of delegation, being able to be clear about exactly what you need done and figuring out, are you the best person to do it? How much would it cost you? How much, for example, is your time worth? And how much would it cost you to get someone else to do it? And is it worth your while delegating this to somebody else? So in other words, part of your ability to be able to organize your workload is figuring out what is the work that you should be doing given your position. What is the work that's worth your time? This is particularly important if you're an entrepreneur. Another technique in terms of organizing your schedule and organizing your time is the ability to say no. And saying no is connected to prioritization as well, but like I always try to say, every time you say no to someone, you're also saying yes to someone else. And every time you say yes to somebody, you're also saying no to somebody else. So every yes is a no, and every no is a yes. And so knowing that, you can start to say no to the things that aren't priorities and yes to the things that are, and that will help you to organize things in a much better way as a result of that also. Definitely use a schedule when you are organizing your workload. Try to make it so that you build a calendar. I promise you, if you build a schedule or a calendar and you stick to it and you make it so that whatever's on that calendar you do, that's going to be transformative to how productive you are. If you can be the kind of person that does it, not just the meetings, but the actual actions, the micro actions or micro tasks that you have, if you can be the kind of person that puts everything on your schedule and does whatever's on your schedule, you're 90% there. And then there's just another 90% to go. See what I did there? Call back. The other thing is to always be working on your ability to manage the projects you have. There's a nice sort of approach, very simple project management structure called Kanban, where you have, for example, a to-do list, then you have doing list, and then you've done list. And visually, you can sort of, on a lot of systems, things like Trello or Asana or Notion, you can take it so that you move an action that's to do, and once you're doing it, you move it into doing, and then once it's done, you can move it into to the done pile. And that's especially helpful if you have a team working for you. Finally, we get into focus stuff that will help you to focus better. And so if you've struggled with focus, you're probably struggling with one of two things. Distraction, which comes from you, right? That's like you get distracted because your brain. Or interruptions. People interrupt you. And sometimes it's insidious. Sometimes the internet interrupts you. Sometimes the little bing or the bong of your phone interrupts you. If you've got a bong in your phone already, you need to change that ringtone or whatnot. But if you've got a Bing that gets your attention, that's already part of the problem. So to improve our focus, there's a few strategies that you can use. The first one is what we call the Pomodoro technique. And this was named by Francesco Cirillo in the late 1980s because when he was a student, he had this like tomato timer, depending on where you live. I'm not sure what he would have called it. He would have called it a Pomodoro. So he was in university, and what he did was he used this timer to measure 25-minute increments and had a 5-minute break. So he would start the timer, 25 minutes, work, study like crazy. Then he would take a 5-minute break when the timer went off, time the 5 minutes, and he would work in 25-minute batches. When he did that, his productivity went to the roof. Why? Because he was so focused, because he knew he only had 25 minutes, giving himself a deadline like that. So giving yourself a deadline like that is a very powerful strategy. Now, it doesn't have to be 25 minutes. It could be 30 minutes, 35, 40 minutes. Wouldn't go much more over 45 minutes in a row. But the idea of it is you're giving yourself a cramped deadline to force you to fully focus so you don't have time to mess about and start following videos of monkeys serving customers in restaurants or cute dogs that have expressions like they are owners and all sorts of weird videos, which of course I would never have fallen and would never have distracted me. But for lesser mortals, I'm sure you might have found that happen. From an evidence-based perspective, one of the most useful strategies for time management in general, never mind focus, is what we call time blocking. This means allocating specific bits of time, taking every single moment in your calendar, and like I mentioned a little bit, organizing it all so that you know exactly where you're spending every part of your calendar. That has been shown through studies to be one of the most important and most useful strategies that you can possibly use to manage your time successfully. There's also what we call batch processing. This means instead of responding to emails for a few minutes here, a few minutes there, whenever they come in, instead decide you're going to do all your emails at specific times during the day and you batch them all there. You're going to create all the content at a particular part of the day. You're going to respond to all phone calls. You're going to do all of that project at a particular time. That's called batch processing. You also have to make sure you're managing your technology. So we'll get interrupted or we'll be distracted by our technology unless we switch it off. You should put your phone in the other room if you really want to focus. Make it so that you're not necessarily always connected to the internet, and try to make it so that when you do need to focus, you're eliminating any potential distractions or interruptions that can come from the world of technology as well. You also might want to organize your workspace as well to make it so that there's not lots of stuff. If you have a desk which you overlook and you look out into the world and there's lots of stuff going on in the city outside of you, don't be too surprised if that's not optimal from a focus perspective. And lastly, you want to set boundaries. You want to make sure people know when they can and can't interrupt you to the best of your ability. I know it's not always possible, but you want to set boundaries so that you can ensure that when it's time to switch off, that you do. And so now we get to something that's a little different, and that is a wonderful book that was written quite recently, just a few years ago, called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. And in this, he mentions 4,000 weeks is after the fact that we've, let's imagine, an average 76-year lifespan. And it really emphasizes the limited nature of our time and how important time is. And as opposed to talking about, here's how to be more productive, here's how to be more efficient, here's how to get more done, he actually takes a different stand. He talks about what he calls a limitation mindset. He says we need to acknowledge the fact that we have a finite amount of time and a finite amount of energy, and that should be a guiding principle for us in what to do with our life. And I want to talk you through sort of 10 insights that I got from studying this book. The first one is the significance of mortality, right? This is the memento mori thing that we discussed earlier, this notion that you are going to die. And that should be something that reminds you of your mortality and helps you to live intentionally and meaningfully. So you've only got a certain amount of days, make them count. And he says it's really important that we remind ourselves of that. He also says to focus on what matters. And what matters ultimately are the relationships that we have, are the moments we spend with others, the experiences that we have. He says stop obsessing with efficiency and enjoy the depth of an experience. Instead of getting caught up in trying to do more, instead, not just the essentialism of doing less, but also really embrace and enjoy the experience of whatever it is that you're doing. So stop trying to do more and do it in a fuller way, really, is what he was getting at. He talks about the joy of missing out as opposed to the FOMO, fear of missing out, the JOMO, the joy of missing out. and learning to be able to chill, just enjoy, just relax, go with the flow. And it's hard to do. It's hard to do because we are working so hard. Like I'm constantly trying to get this done, get that done, get this podcast episode done, get this one done. And it's like, do. And instead, what we need to do is we need to experience. And it's a little bit, it can sound cliched or whatnot, but I find myself constantly trying to be productive. And I really liked learning about the importance, or being reminded rather, of the importance of going deep as opposed to, focusing on quantity. It's really the quality of the experience as opposed to the quantity. He also talks about limitation, fostering creativity. Constraints really lead to creativity, something I spend a lot of time talking to different organizations about whenever I go into creativity. Accept unpredictability and learn to let go of control. You can't control what happens and you got to be able to go with the flow. Routines should serve us. So think about routines that allow you to make your life easier. So don't get into routines that just push you to the point where you're not enjoying it. Make sure the routine serves you and helps improve the quality of your life. The myth of a perfect plan, again, sort of nodding to good old Murphy there, right? That nice little insult. Stop chasing illusions of progress, the feeling we're making progress in some way when actually all we're doing is giving ourselves more things to do and keeping busier. And then finding meaning in the everyday. Again, this notion of going deep and finding meaning. And I really love that because I think that when I was thinking of doing a episode on how to become super productive, I believe that we have to ask ourselves the question, what are we trying to produce? And it's not always about producing work. Sometimes it's producing moments. It's producing happiness. It's producing meaning. And for us to produce happiness, for us to produce moments, for us to produce meaning, what we really need to look for is ensuring that every moment we spend, we're doing so to create a net benefit for ourselves. And that means ensuring we're doing the most effective things. And that's being effective. But it's not being effective because we need to get more work done. It's being effective so that our life becomes just a little bit better. And sometimes this limitation mindset, this idea of accepting that we need to embrace life a bit more and enjoy it and not push ourselves to constantly be more and more and more efficient. Sometimes the pursuit of being productive is very unproductive and creates the wrong kind of thing. So I think it's a nice sort of counterpoint to everything else that we talked about today. So I'm hoping that you have a more deep understanding of time management and productivity. And I hope that this is something that provides you with a number of things you can do to become even more productive, but not too productive. That becomes even more efficient, but not too efficient. That becomes even more effective, but not too effective. And you find some balance. If we were to summarize it, where does this leave us? Well, prioritize better, organize better, focus better, and remember to chill, brah. Remember to chill. Always remember to chill. If you want to chill more while reading a newsletter, fitzpatrick.com/newsletter. If you want to chill more by subscribing to my YouTube channel, subscribe. If you want to chill more by following me on social media, you can do so. If you want to chill more by spreading the word and letting more people know about this podcast, please do. As you know, I pack a massive amount of stuff into a podcast episode. Your brain's probably exhausted here. But I want to do this because I want to be as efficient as possible. Anyway, take care. Thanks very much for watching. I didn't get up at 3:30 a.m. this morning. I didn't jump into my ice bath. I did, in fact, go back to sleep. But when I woke, I realized that the moments that I had in that bed were some of the most wonderful moments of my day. And soon I'll be returning to my bed to enjoy more of those moments. I wish that for you as well. Take care, be well, may the force be with you. I'll talk to you soon. And check out one of my other videos.